Welcome to our University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar. I'm Joan Brzezinski and I direct the China Center. Thank you for your support of the China Center in this webinar series. Your generosity and time help make these programs possible. For a special thanks to Kaimei Terry and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. We invite you to help advance our mission and give to the China Center, either through the link on your webinar announcement or our website. Today, Professor Marquis is going to answer questions that you submit through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen towards the end of the program. So I invite you to stick around to ask your questions. We're thrilled today that Professor Christopher Marquis has joined us today to talk about his new book, Mao and Markets, The Communist Roots of Chinese Enterprise, which was named to Financial Times list of best books in 2022. Professor Marquis is a senior professor of Chinese management at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge, and a fellow at Jesus College at Cambridge. All right, Professor Marquis, your book challenges the idea that as China opened to the global economy over the last 40 years, it would embrace free markets and the state control of the economy would be liberalized. But I think that was a bit wishful, and maybe we're learning that it was more hopeful than we thought. So we're looking forward to your thoughts and hearing more about your book. Welcome.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Joan, for inviting me and the very kind introduction. Really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that, my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, and really happy to have all of you join. I think it's wonderful to have dialogue and discussion on these important events. I can't say that, I've been working on this research now for over 10 years, and things were very different when I started the research. No sort of balloons or other flying objects that were creating controversy between the different countries, sort of the West and China. And as Joan mentioned, what we try to do in this book is really understand, in some ways, almost from a first principles perspective, the governance of China, both political and economic, in order to hopefully engage in a more productive way. I think, Joan used the term wishful thinking, and I think that definitely, definitely we had some blinders on, I think, as far as how the Chinese political economy operates, and then the strategies that we need to engage in to effectively both compete and cooperate, as I think the U.S. foreign policy team actually now discusses things. My background is a little different than many people that write books about China. So I actually do not have a PhD in Chinese studies. I'm a PhD in sociology, and when I studied actually the U.S. banking industry for my dissertation, and did a lot of work on sort of early U.S. financial history. But I started actually in around 2000, and a lot of the work that I've done as well is around environmental and social impacts, and around sort of post-Olympics, 2008 Olympics in China. I started actually spending a lot of time in the country for some of the work I was doing at the time at Harvard Business School, where I was a professor. So I'm at Cambridge now. I've just joined Cambridge about a year ago. Before that, I spent 7 years at Cornell, and before that, over 10 years at Harvard. And I was doing a lot of work there in regards to sort of environmental factors and environmental management, sustainability, even some work on civil society in China, and spent between 2010 and 2020. I spent a total of close to 4 years actually in China cumulatively. I was still working, during the school year at universities, but I spent a couple sabbatical periods and a variety of other sort of, month here, month there, et cetera, that sort of added up over time. And as Joan also mentioned in her kind introduction, the combination of vibrant markets and sort of centralized authoritarian communist political structure, usually is not seen as compatible. And I think China has really, and the success of China's economy in the past 40 years has really sort of thrown those economic assumptions out the window. And those economic assumptions really undergirded a lot of policy. And just a couple sort of anecdotes to sort of how those sort of realizations would come to me over time. So I, for both at Harvard and Cornell, would take students to China for, this would be during winter break, would go for 10 days to 2 weeks, visit a lot of different, sort of leading companies. Alibaba, as example, I visited a number of times, number of SOEs in Beijing, a number of manufacturing companies down in southern China, Foshan, Guangdong area. And so students would say to me, they would frequently, I would hear, China, really is not like a communist country, because what they were seeing was, these amazing cities, incredible infrastructure, vibrant markets. And so it's a puzzle. I mean, I think it was a puzzle to them. And I think for a long time, a puzzle to me too. For instance, one more sort of quick anecdote around this is that, so I early in my time spending time in China, probably 2010, 2011, I went to the office of the CEO of Costco, the largest shipping company, named Wei Jiafu, or Fu Jiawei, I guess. And walking into his office, there is a life-size statue of Chairman Mao, and sort of intersecting over the statue, the flag of China, and then also the flag of the Chinese Communist Party, same, I think, color red, but actually having hammer and sickle, sort of the sort of traditional sort of emblem of communism. And this was really very puzzling to me. And I was like, okay, is he doing this just as a display? This is something that leaders just have to show that they care about this, sort of ideology. And if so, does that display have a material effect on the business, on people's career? So I think, as a, sort of trained sociologist, it's these kind of social science questions I'm interested in. Or, is this something deeper? Actually, there is a deep sort of belief and sort of wellspring of sort of legacy of Mao that undergirds the economy. And that last one is sort of the more interesting one, actually, from at least my perspective. And I think this graph here that I have on the slide is sort of an interesting depiction of that. So you see the blue line, which is China's GDP growth rate, which is really without historical precedent. So this 40 years where China grew for almost 10% a year, you looked at sort of the growth spurts of like Japan or Korea, 10% they sustained for, 10, 15 years max. I mean, China actually sustained that for 40 years. But also this increasing focus of, the party and growing the party. So anyways, this sort of contradiction is what we're trying to really understand from a sort of data-driven social science perspective that also then hopefully provides some insight into policy and business. So we started off and I was talking a little bit about maybe some of the misperceptions of the West. And so already mentioned this sort of one here around, traditional economic theory that describes how economic development will lead to political liberalization, potentially democratization. This, again, I mean, I think the 40 years, almost 40 years of US and Western engagement policy to China was premised on this. If you look at China's admission to the WTO in 2001, things like President Clinton would say, that actually, economic development is a one-way street. And the idea being that it leads directly to democratization. So I think this, particularly the last few years, as Xi Jinping has in some ways sort of doubled down on sort of commitment to the CCP model, both in politics and business, I think has been pretty widely debunked. It's too bad our book didn't come out, a couple of years ago. We would have maybe people would have rejected it. But it's sort of this is something that I think we provide some details on why this failed, but it's something that's sort of well known. And another sort of and somewhat related, but also distinct misperception is that, because the Soviet Union collapsed, that all communist systems must be sort of fragile to top-heavy and will just disintegrate in some way over time under their own weight. And this, the vibrancy and growth of China, I think, also, throws this assumption out the window. And then finally, another, I think, misperception that we've had is around the extent of the flexibility of the CCP in its management of the economy, and maybe the flexibility with which it's willing to take. So that cartoon there, you probably recognize is of Deng Xiaoping, who is really credited, after Mao passed away in 1976, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, really, engaging in almost like an economic 180 and introducing what is known as a reform and opening policy. And he has a lot of, I think, really very insightful, pithy quotes that encapsulate the system. So, here you can see in the cartoon, he's holding two cats, one black, one white. A famous saying is, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. The idea being that, we'll accept, we want what's best for China, economically. If it's markets, we'll use those. If it's plan, we'll use those. And he also said, which I think also really insightfully, is that, plans and markets are really just tools. And, all of this sort of discussion around sort of ideology and different broader systems, mixes that up, and that actually we should think about just, maybe a market as a tool, a plan as a tool, maybe can exist within a more centrally driven communist structure. So these are, I think, some of the things we got wrong. And I think, this is so important today because even, as we speak, these issues are playing out in ways that are surprising, even to me, having written this book, and also, sort of the timing is really surprising. So on the right-hand side is actually from yesterday's Bloomberg Business Week, reporting on a recent meeting that Xi Jinping had with some new and other senior party leaders, where he sort of rejects the Western model and advocates that actually China's economic success has proven that the sort of state-driven CCP model with a lot of control over private enterprises is a viable alternative, and that really China was going to double down, so to speak, on that model. This contrasts, however, with, on the left-hand side, you see that's Liu He, who is a senior leader and very responsible for a lot of economic affairs. He was in Davos a few weeks ago and describes how, China is open for business. You see other reports in the media of like the Chinese Tech Authority also describing, being open for, where they're stopping these crackdowns, which have gone on for a number of years and also going to be very open for business. And so I think, these are very diametrically opposed visions. And I think we in the West are still oriented to, hearing with sort of very rosy images, Liu He, and not actually focusing as much as we should on what Xi Jinping says. This confirmation bias, this is a psychological bias where, everyone, it's I think a universal bias where people actually are more likely to sort of believe and search out evidence that actually corresponds to their existing beliefs. So, reading things recently also about, entrepreneurs escaping to Singapore or fleeing China. These are things that we in the West would think would be rational things to do after the COVID lockdowns and the, sort of botched, opening up. But, maybe we're overemphasizing them because they sort of confirm, what we think, China should be doing. So I think, we really need to be very, try to be even-handed in our sort of assessment of these. And I think, the key thing for me is that I think that, when the supreme leader, Xi Jinping, is saying they're doubling down on creating an alternative model to the West, that I think the signal is very clear, and it tells me that what Liu He is saying, I would take with a grain of salt, basically. So I think another reason sort of that we talk a little bit about in the book that also makes it very difficult for us in the West to truly sort of grasp the system in China is another psychological bias, or not psychological bias, but another sort of psychological process is actually there's longstanding research in psychology around how Eastern and Western societies have fundamentally different cognitive orientations. So in the West, stemming early from Aristotle to, even the way parenting is done, people focus much more on categorizing. So basically, finding differences between items, and that is what is emphasized. As an example, sort of one of the studies looks at parents, and when parents are interacting with their children, they're about sort of describing, different entities and how they actually they have distinguishing characteristics. Like my phone, maybe I would describe that in certain ways. Sort of distinguishing it from, my bag or whatever I have, here on my desk. And so this, we see actually the state and the market in many ways as analytically distinct entities or spheres in society. And I think this is where, I mentioned the Deng Xiaoping quote where he's saying, the market and plan are basically just tools. I think really, unpacks the fact that actually these different, we shouldn't put so much value on, sort of labeling things from a more macro perspective, but actually try to understand how they're interrelated. And this is where the research into cognitive orientations in Eastern societies, China being one of them, also there's Korea and Japan have been studied this as well, is that it's much more about interdependence, ability to integrate contradictory forces. And so this idea of sort of the state and the market being analytically distinct is not necessary in China. And I think that just structurally how things are set up really shows that. So, unlike the West, where actually, the state and the market, actually are distinct, here in China, I think it's important remember that actually all of this falls under the Chinese Communist Party. And so you have, the state and market, again, they can be tools as long as they're fulfilling the interests and needs of the party. And I think that the fact that the military actually, China is one of the few countries where the military reports into a political party as opposed to the actual state, I think really sort of emphasizes that. So what we try to do in the book to try to provide a more both, I think, grounds up in evidence-based set of understanding of how the Chinese political economy is formed is actually trace back to a number of Maoist ideas and campaigns, and how then those have had continuity over time. In that when we look at Xi Jinping now, many people were surprised at how hardline he's been, all the crackdowns on different industries, which seems like economic suicide, as an example. But actually, if you consider the trend as the Deng in Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao period, that does seem like a surprise. But actually, if you actually connect a thread to Mao, it's less of a surprise. And maybe in this way, the period of post 1978 is more the aberration, and perhaps our appreciation of it, grounded in our own biases, sort of missed a number of the key trends. The sort of analytical framework we adopt to really unpack and understand this is called an imprinting perspective. So there's a research in a number of different social sciences, from sociology, economics, political science, and many others, about how early leaders have a lasting effect. And there's a lot of reasons why they do this. I mean, if you think about the US, there's lasting influence of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and their ideas about, financial structure and how, local versus national finance should be shaped, just as one example. There's a number of studies looking at France and how, the sort of systems and culture set up by Louis XIV, still resonate today. And so we are looking at trying to really unpack and understand sort of how and why these sort of the ideas, principles, and institutions of Mao continue to have an influence. And so here is some of the areas we look at. And so, we look at in the book, basically a key differentiator in the individuals we look at, and this is, business leaders, of large public companies, entrepreneurs of more smaller enterprises, growing companies. And we look at, part of our research is using large databases of those firms to sort of unpack trends, underlying trends over time. We also do a lot of interviews with entrepreneurs at many different levels and many different locations throughout China. I mean, I myself have interviewed hundreds of leaders and entrepreneurs in China about this topic and others, and a number of other sort of historical sources we use as well. I'll say a little bit about the methods in a second. So yeah, we look at the CCP and non-CCP members as one sort of distinction, and how they actually behave very differently in their political and economic affairs. Why we think this might be different. So one perspective is there's like a socialization process. Entering the CCP, an individual has to go through a variety of different sort of sets, classes, workshops, watching documentaries, hearing speakers, reading speeches, working with mentors, writing reports, writing self, reflections and criticisms. All of these are, imbuing a deeper sense of sort of the party ideology into the individual's thinking. This also is continually reinforced in the broader society as well. One of the things that really got me thinking in more detail about sort of the deep and lasting influence of the communist ideology and CCP in China was actually a number of years ago, probably 6, 7, 8 years ago now. I was on an admissions panel at Cornell for PhD students. And I looked at a transcript. I was sort of scrolling through, an applicant's file, a Chinese applicant. And just is, in the scrolling, the Chinese characters, Mao Zedong, popped off the page at me. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Why is Mao's name in the middle of this person's transcript? And then I looked closer and it said Mao Zedong Sishang, and I forget what the rest of the was. It was a title of a course. And then I looked a little closer, and this was a required class. And I saw actually the student had 2 required classes of Mao thought, Maoism, and then I looked at other Chinese applicants and had very similarly had actually all taken required classes in Maoism. So this is an example of how throughout the education system these ideas continue to be reinforced. Also, through movies, documentaries, particularly around the 100-year anniversary of the CCP, there was tons of popular culture media. There's red tourism, actively promoted, sort of going to revolutionary sites. I myself have been to Mao's hometown of Shaoshan. Really amazing to me, the depth of worship actually of Mao at that site. I've been to a number of former US leaders' homes. I'm someone who's interested in history. So I've been to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in the Washington, D.C. area. And that, not many people go there. It's usually sort of nerdy, bookish type people. It's not really a popular tourist destination, although very nice though it is. You can bike to there from the DC, which I did, which was a nice adventure. Also, I've been to Monticello, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia, home of Thomas Jefferson. Here too, beautiful place, but not very many people. So this really didn't prepare me for visiting Mao's hometown. So I was actually it's in the town that I mentioned, Shaoshan, is in Hunan province, not that far from Changsha, which is a much larger, much more well-known city in Hunan. And I was there to interview and meet with some companies. And I told one of the companies I was visiting, I'd love to go, while there to Mao's hometown. And they thought this was very, very strange, but they want to be good hosts. So they, very kindly, arranged for me to have a car, from their company to go. And I mean, I guess the reason why I thought it was strange is that, this is not a place that many Westerners went to. I was the only Western I saw there, but, I must say it was actually more like Graceland, which is, as many of you know, probably, Elvis's a home, home, a place of sort of worship and commerce, as opposed to a reverential or nerdy political leader home. I mean, it was packed. Had to wait in a long line to actually go into Mao's house. Which actually is a pretty large house. I mean, I thought of Mao as he was actually pretty, I think pretty well off, or at least they've reconstructed the house in a nice way. But the thing that really was sort of telling to me, and why I sort of use the Graceland metaphor, is the extent to which there were things with Mao's image on them being sold. you can't imagine. I mean, I have a number of things now with I have a cigarette box. I mean, I don't smoke and never smoked, but it's sort of a handy little box to carry things in. I have a Mao statue, with actually emblazoned with his name, sort of the name of the town, to sort of say that I got it in that special place. And I was the only Westerner there. I mean, just under attack for being sold things. And so I think, this was another sort of thing that really told me the depth of Mao's resonance. And so nowadays, coming back to today, there's this concept in China nowadays called historical nihilism, which is basically if you like talk about sort of unapproved history, basically. So there's sort of the proved history, and if you talk about it, I think talking about Mao actually frequently is sort of falls under the historical nihilism bucket. So history is very much protected as an asset to the as a legitimating asset to the Communist Party regime. A second set of items that reflect Mao's imprint are the institutions in China. So the first is more sort of cultural, social. The second is the sort of institutions. And I mentioned Deng Xiaoping and his so-called flexibility. I just want to mention here that actually since Mao, all of the political leaders have significantly emphasized the importance of Mao's ideas and governance principles to the management of China. So, Deng Xiaoping, when he actually, advocated for the reform and opening period in the late, 70s, and I think it was, written in the Chinese Constitution in the early 80s, described, the reform and opening was part of a set of policy package, so to speak, of the two basic points. And the first basic point had four principles that were basically maintaining the CCP at the center, using Mao Zedong thought in the governance processes, et cetera. So, but we in the West, I think, again, this is about the confirmation bias. I think this is about wishful thinking. We have focused very much on the reform and opening, but actually ignored the other side-by-side basic point, which is about maintenance of the, sort of communist authoritarian system. Related to this as well, in the last few years, is again sort of part of the policing, so to speak, of the legitimacy of the CCP. There's been a big effort to avoid what happened in the Soviet Union, and I think this is where very much the historical nihilism idea gets propagated and perpetuated. So there was a documentary, as an example, in the last number of years. I think it was something called like Historical Nihilism and the Collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. I can't remember the exact name, but it had historical nihilism in the title. And the basic point of this is that a big reason why the Soviet Union collapsed is due to their leaders sort of rejecting the prior system and leaders. And so Khrushchev, was seen to, Khrushchev actively rejected and criticized Stalin's rule of China, or excuse me, rule of the Soviet Union. And so this is why, one of the reasons why Mao is so firmly held on to. I'm going to skip over that. A little bit about research methods, and I realize I'm going on for a long time here. I want to get to sort of Q&A and discussion. To give you a sense, and this is 10 years plus of peer-reviewed academic research studies, many Harvard Business School case studies, and we use really the empirical, more statistical type of research to undergird our ideas. But actually in the book, I think this is why, Joan kindly mentioned the nice recognition from the Financial Times. We try to write it in a very sort of readable way through, telling stories and examples, but really our ideas and conclusions are firmly based in empirical analyses. A number of different sort of sets of analyses. So one is the database of entrepreneurs. Another is publicly traded firms. And these are existing databases that we got. Maybe we coded some additional variables, but we also ourselves collected data on politicians' histories, city politicians, to understand how their backgrounds influence how they engage with business in their city. Again, I mentioned we did interviews. I've personally, over these 10 years, hundreds of Chinese entrepreneurs and business leaders and politicians. But for this research project specifically, we interviewed 32 people to ask them questions basically about the topics that we're examining. Also examine newspaper text and entrepreneurship. So that's it. So let me. I'm just going to please enter your questions. I'm going to use this close to being closing, even though I have a lot more slides about each of the chapters. So to understand Mao's influence on China, we divide the book into 3 separate sections. So the first is about his ideas and principles. So how Mao's, a number of his key ideological principles that we can then sort of trace into business, into being manifest, as well as a number of his military principles. So here are some of the ones that we look at. So, aspects of nationalism, excessive frugality, devotion, sort of mass line. I think, common prosperity, which she has been emphasizing in recent years. Also a Mao idea. My military strategies, for instance, so this is, I think, an interesting aspect of the book that I think people know of this. This has been sort of discussed before, but I until really researching this, I was unaware of it. I was aware that actually a lot of times in the business world, business leaders follow military strategies. So von Clausewitz, sort of famous example, Sun Tzu, also famous example. But many entrepreneurs and business leaders actually also follow a number of Mao's military strategies. So, there's this idea of surrounding the cities from the countryside. Those of you who are Chinese in the audience probably have heard of this strategy. So this was actually, a key revolutionary strategy that helped the CCP take China from the KMT in 1949, eventually triumphing in 1949. So, traditional Marxist-Leninist ideas, articulated by Karl Marx and then also implemented in the Soviet Union by Lenin and others, focused on, fomenting revolution among industrial workers in cities. Marx, when he was doing a lot of his writing, was actually in the UK, which was an obviously industrial city, industrial country, and London, where he lived, factory-filled city. Lenin and the Soviet Union had a lot more industry than China, and for a number of years, the Chinese leaders, CCP leaders, tried to follow that strategy and failed, because actually China did not at that time have a lot of factory workers in cities. But Mao said, okay, what we have is a lot of peasants in the countryside. Let's actually organize and conquer the countryside first, and then based on the strength of that, conquer the cities. This is surround the cities from countryside. So a number of businesses use this, and I think that it's, it reflects to, the underlying political economy and geography, economic geography of China. Still very large rural population, maybe 600 million people still, third, fourth tier cities, a lot of population. So, Huawei, credits this strategy for its early success. Ren Zhengfei discusses how, trying to compete against, at the time, Lucent and Alcatel, these large telecommunication providers, was not possible. They needed to do this surround the city from countryside. Pinduoduo also used this in its competition against Alibaba and JD. Those were these large incumbents, very big in first tier and second tier cities, and they grew based on smaller cities. So I think this is an example. Also, we look at a number of mass campaigns. This is something where the governance of China, and I think very much dates, or very much influence of Mao, focuses on campaign politics, as opposed to, what in the West is sort of more, sort of regular governance. And so, Mao's sort of famous for his campaigns, back, Yan'an rectification, where, he purged a lot of the early leaders and took control of the party. Great Leap Forward, sort of famous example of, one of Mao's economic campaigns, where the goal was to industrialize China very rapidly, catching up to the US and UK, or surpass, I forget, I think it's a catch up to the US and surpass the UK, and collectivized a lot of the countryside. Sort of long tragic story led to this huge famine where upwards of 40 million people have died. Also has a lasting effect on the business environment, which we can possibly talk to in the questions and answers. Cultural Revolution, Third Front Construction are two others. And then finally, we talk about the different institutions in the book, things like, party branches, which are in the news, also referred to as party cells. We use the sort of more neutral term branch. Also, the way the political structure provides a lot of decentralized leadership in provinces and cities, which allows experimentation, which stemmed from Mao's military organization. So, it seems we have about a little more than 15 minutes, and I have a lot more slides, but that gives you a general overview of, I think, our general approach, how Mao has its influence, and why we think it's important, given this wishful thinking that I think the US and the West is engaged in, by focusing too much on reform and opening, and maybe not as enough on the Maoist aspects of China, and that actually sort of we need to balance that as we continue to compete and cooperate with China. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'd love to have comments, questions. So I'm going to stop the screen share.
Thank you, Professor Marquis. The questions have stacked up here, so let's go. In the governance diagram that you did early on, sort of like Venn, the military is separate. Doesn't it overlap with the market and the economy?
Yeah, I that's a good point. I'll revise that. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the key thing that we wanted to show with that is just that it reports into the CCP. But you're right. I mean, and I know that there's been some for a long time, many of the sort of PLA branches actually had businesses associated. I think there's been an effort to separate the businesses, but I think that you're right. That should be overlapping, to be more accurate. Thank you.
So from your talk, the reverence for the Communist Party places that on history is effective in Chinese development and citizenship. Do you think our self-critical view of our own US history will have a diminishing effect on citizenship and national cohesion?
Okay, one second. Yeah, good, interesting question. I mean, I think so my view is a need to be self-critical. I mean, actually, in my, I mean, so our goal is to not say whether this focus on Mao is good or bad, but actually to sort of understand it so that we can actually respond, better to China's as an economic system, as a political system. And I would say that one of the things that is, I don't know, worrying to me is not the right way to put it, but I think, the real lack of appetite for discussing critical issues like, Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or issues with Taiwan, I think is a weakness of the CCP model. And I think it shows insecurity, to be honest. I mean, the US, we have horrible things from, systemic racism to horrible treatment of Native peoples throughout our history. And these are things that we can't just brush under the rug. We have to actually talk about them and recognize that they still exist, and try to make them better, not just say there's this term historical nihilism and no one can, I think actually, not to show my political things, but I think that actually some of the things that the governor of Florida is doing around Black Lives Matter teaching is very reminiscent of the CCP historical nihilism. And I think it really detracts from the US. And I think that China's focus on this is an expression of weakness.
The CCP has stated that bringing up top tech talent into China is a key party objective. Given what appears to be less attractive economic and academic atmosphere, do you have insight on how the CCP will attract Chinese students, tech talent, and other global entrepreneurs back to China when it opens after COVID?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think that, so I am not, for a long time, pretty optimistic about, and so impressed with the sort of economic growth that's happened in China. It's a true economic miracle, and hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, and there's tremendous amount of wealth that's been created. However, I think that these really hardline crackdowns that have occurred in the most recent period, I think will be very detrimental to the country and its economic growth in the long term. I think that it will impede innovation. I think it's somewhat arbitrary, actually, and I think that so as a result, I think investors will be fearful of engaging in China, and I think that talent will stay away. And so so I think it's I'm not super optimistic about the future of China given the recent number of years.
How related is imprinting to filial piety?
Yeah. So filial piety is, as I sort of understand it, I think frequently tied to sort of Confucian belief of having sort of respect and reverence and treating well your parents and elders. I think that actually might play into the sort of imprinting process we talk about, because that is intergenerational transmission is how ideas end up sort of lasting. And so if you have a lot of reverence and respect for the past and your earlier generations, I think there's a stronger hold on that. But sort of imprinting, as it's described in the literatures, is typically a broader process of a lot of different social, cultural, and institutional processes. But I think that as I described, they fit together a bit.
Is there a system of checks and balances in Chinese system?
Yeah, good question. So I think that, so for a long time, sort of post Deng Xiaoping, they talked about this sort of collective leadership balancing where, different sort of elders and different camps would actually negotiate, which is sort of like a check and balance. I mean, it's not check and balance in the United States where you have, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, but it does actually, among the leadership, actually provide some both continuity and there won't be something where there's a leader for life. So, however, as we know, this in the last few years, particularly at the 20th Party Congress, what was seen as actually checks and balances was totally overturned by Xi Jinping, both in his taking a third term as the supreme leader, which was seen as part of the checks and balances, and then also the standing committee of the CCP, which is like the top, 7 folks. There were not sort of representatives of the other camp, in that list. That's actually basically all of his loyalists, and that is a check and balance which is gone. And that's also, if you read some of the, at least to me, analyses of like why Hu Jintao ended up, sort of being unceremoniously escorted out of the sort of meeting at the 20th Party Congress, is that he discovered that some of the checks and balances, names that were supposed to be on there from his sort of camp were not part of that. So, well, a lot of this is, it's a huge black box, and a lot, this is something that is not very transparent, even among, the most learned of, sort of Zhongnanhai watchers. But yeah, so I think whatever checks and balances were there have mostly been abandoned or overturned by Xi.
Relatedly, do you think there's any Chinese traditions that counter Maoism, like Confucianism or Buddhism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So clearly there is, a bigger, so we have a sort of cultural and historical lens on China, and we've particularly chosen to focus on these ideas of Mao. But broadly speaking, there are other cultural traditions. Clearly, Confucianism has had a huge influence. There's a question about filial piety, the way the bureaucracy is structured. Some of Mao's actually, I think Confucianism was one of the 4 olds, but actually a number of Mao's ideas from, around the sort of serve the people and frugality actually resonate with Confucian ideas. And so I think some of them actually show up in some of the Mao ideas. And one of the reasons why some of his ideas resonate, even though he was rejecting the olds, actually, tapped into them in a subtle way. And there is research that looks at how Chinese entrepreneurs do have a Confucian ethos. So I do think that is a balancing or additional factor. Nice question. Thank you.
And in their articulated observable strategy to achieve improved common prosperity for all Chinese.
Yeah.
Is there one, I guess?
Yeah. So again, I should actually, your question has prompted me to sort of study this a bit more, because I've gotten sort of similar questions previously, and I'll give you my general answer. So, this idea of common prosperity, I think, in theory, is really important. The levels of economic inequality in China are tremendous. I mean, there is some published Gini coefficients, but for my spending time in China, I sort of don't believe what they are, because the level of wealth among millions of people is vast, and I mean, many people have been lifted out of poverty, but their level of poverty is also, or just the level of, standard living among the sort of billion plus people at the bottom of the Chinese pyramid is vast. I mean, as 2 quick examples, one of the times I lived in Shanghai, I lived in an apartment. You went in the basement and it was, like Ferrari, Lamborghini, Rolls Royce, a couple BMWs or Mercedes. I didn't have a car, fortunately. I'll never be able to afford them. but then, I employed an IE, a helper to come, and, she cooked and cleaned and helped with my kids. And I can't remember, it's a number of years ago. I think we paid her like 2000, I don't know if it was 2005, maybe I think $400 a month or something like that. And, we wanted to pay more, but like the agency that intermediated it, like so that gives you an example of the economic inequality that exists. And so I think certainly some of those Ferraris can be sold and money given, certainly. So I think that in theory, I'm in favor of it. But I think it needs to be done in a much more systematic way. And they have things like, real estate taxes, other progressive taxation. As my understanding of how it's implemented, it's sort of more take from the rich, give the poor. And there's these press releases about how Alibaba or JD or their leaders are sort of giving, 20 billion renminbi to the government, as a result of this. And so it seems like almost a tool to extract money from people that are sort of annoying to the government, as opposed to a general economic development strategy. I think if there was to be a common prosperity economic development to shift more money to people in rural areas and the poor, I think that would be a very good thing.
Is it fair to say that U.S. businesses interests were too quick to believe, perhaps naively, that China would undergo a miraculous conversion to free market capitalism once the Chinese began to enjoy the wonders of capitalism?
I think that's very fair to say, and I think that's actually still the case. This is, I mean, again, like Liuhe's discussion at Davos, just the, sort of salivating from the business elite that you would read about as a result of that. People sort of forget these last 3 years of really tough, hardline crackdowns and ignore the fact that Xi Jinping himself is saying that actually, our economy is actually been very successful, and we're going to keep it like it is, and actually just increase the, more sort of hardline elements to the exclusion of the open elements. So I think that there's still a lot of naivete and wishful thinking. I think the governments around the world are a little bit more sober-eyed, but I think the business community, I mean, and they see these giant markets and they want to get back in there, no doubt about it. But I think, I think our government leaders hopefully will maintain a bit more, bit more clarity in what's national security concerns, which not.
Thank you. This was a really fascinating talk, and I appreciate you being with us today. Your book is available, and it's very widely praised. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's a really interesting read. So thank you for attending our webinar today. Our next webinar will be on March 22nd, and we've invited Professor Diana Fu from University of Toronto. So everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all, everyone, for joining. Enjoyed our discussion. Bye-bye.